Well, it's nearly 8 o'clock Eastern, and polls are about to close in 6 states, right? 16 states, including New Hampshire, where there's a very tight Senate race, of course, between Jeanne Shaheen, the incumbent, and Scott Brown, who was recently, for a time, the senator from Massachusetts. Plus 2 big governor's races in Florida, where former Governor Charlie Crist is challenging Republican Rick Scott. And, of course, Pennsylvania, where I grew up, where voters are about to dump their governor for the first time in history. You know,
Pennsylvania has a long history, too.
Well, actually, it's not as long as I made it sound. Governors were allowed to start running for re-election in Milton Schaaf could run in 74 for re-election. They had a long period of just one-term governorships, and then they allowed to run. This is 40 years, however. First time somebody's been dumped. There was a strong tradition of serving 2 terms. It's hard to tell exactly why Tom Corbett became immensely unpopular, but I think one part of it is he cut education, and that was a big mistake.
At this point, it is 8 o'clock right now on the East Coast, and NBC News can project that the Republican Party has maintained control of the House of Representatives. This is not a characterization of any one individual race. This tells you the overall control in the House right now. Out of 435 seats, the NBC News projection, plus or minus 8 seats, is that Republicans will control 242 seats. Democrats will control 193. So single-digit losses for the Democrats in terms of what's being projected right now by NBC News.
Well, there's always the problem that, you know, we always hope that a new president, and if it's Hillary Clinton next time around, would like to see, if she wins, to come in with a mandate. Most people would say better to govern than not being able to govern. That's an objective statement. And one of the goals of the Republican campaign committee this time was to build up enough padding so that even if she won the nomination next time, even if she came in with a decent majority, that she would not bring the House with her and wouldn't be able to govern. This is an amazingly negative goal, by the way. To basically say, let's undermine her before she gets in there.
But it's the substance.
But I think we're going to see if they get up to 240 or something like that tonight, or 245, where their real goal was, it's going to be real trouble for her. But I think, as it was argued earlier by Steve Israel, they still have a potential to win it all back in 2 years. In
terms of what just happened in all the states, these 16 states where polls have just closed, let me tell you what we know first in terms of the Senate, and then we'll get to the governors. First one, all eyes on this race. Jeanne Shaheen in New Hampshire against Scott Brown. NBC's characterization of this race is too early to call at this point, just 9% of the expected vote in. In New Jersey, the Senate race there, Cory Booker, the Democratic incumbent, is projected as the winner by NBC News, as is Massachusetts Democratic incumbent Ed Markey will be returning to the Senate, according to NBC News projections. In Mississippi, Thad Cochran had a heck of a fight in the Republican primary, but he is the projected winner tonight. NBC News projecting that Thad Cochran has been reelected, as has Republican incumbent Susan Collins in the great state of Maine. From a long way out, it looked like she might have a fight on this one, but as it got closer, it was hers to lose, and she did not. Illinois Senate candidate Dick Durbin, of course, reelected Democratic incumbent there. He's the projected winner, according to NBC News projections. In Tennessee, Lamar Alexander, the Republican incumbent, is projected to hold on to his seat in Tennessee. Now, in the great state of Oklahoma, we've actually got both Senate seats up. Jim Inhofe was up at the end of his most recent full term in the Senate. He's projected to hold on to his seat. And in the Oklahoma Senate special election, James Lankford is the projected winner in Oklahoma. Oklahoma, one of 2 states tonight that has both Senate seats on the line. In Rhode Island, the Democratic incumbent Jack Reed is projected to be the winner by NBC News. In the state of Alabama, the Senate race there, Republican incumbent Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III is projected by NBC News to be holding on to his seat. And in the state of Delaware, Chris Coons, who had such an interesting race not long ago in that race in 2010, Christopher Coons, the incumbent, the projected winner by NBC News. Now, in the North Carolina Senate race, there's a few Senate races that we are still watching. There's 13% of the expected vote in thus far in South Carolina. Kay Hagan versus Tom Tillis. You see how close that is. That is being described as too close to call by NBC News projections. In Georgia, in that Senate race, we've only got 3% of the expected vote in. David Perdue, the Republican, versus Michelle Nunn, the Democrat. That is too early to call, according to NBC News. And interestingly, this turned out to be a fascinating one to watch. Virginia Senate, 34% in, so just over a third of the vote in. NBC calling Ed Gillespie versus Mark Warner too early to call in the state of Virginia. In terms of the overall look in the Senate pickup so far, there has been one definite Republican pickup in the state of West Virginia. The overall Senate chamber right now looks like this. 40 Republican seats, 37 Democratic seats, and two independents who have caucused with Democrats in the past. Bernie Sanders most certainly will continue to do that in the future. Angus King might get interesting depending on what else happens over the course of the night. Now let's look at what's going on in terms of the governor's races. In Pennsylvania, the projected winner, NBC News projecting that Tom Corbett has lost his seat. The Democrat challenger, Tom Wolf, will be the new governor of Pennsylvania, according to NBC News projections. Before I go on, I actually have to get your reaction to that, Chris Matthews.
A very interesting candidate, entrepreneur, creates jobs, meets the paycheck, takes care of, meets the payroll. Not a Philadelphian, somewhere for the middle part of the state. Very unusual challenge. They're used to running against ethnics in big cities like Ed Rendell or somewhere like that. This guy came out of nowhere. This guy beat Allison Schwartz, who was a strong candidate in the primaries. He spent $10 million of his own money in the primaries.
Was Schwartz the establishment candidate? That's how it felt.
No, well, it's hard because she didn't really have the big city machine behind her. She did. She had Bob Brady behind her, but she was a suburbanite mainly. She was part of Montgomery County, part of Northeast Philly, where I grew up. She never really had the sort of the sweep of support across the city. She thought, you know what she didn't do right? A very attractive candidate if she'd gone on television. She never did any television. She never ran.
I want to very quickly, Emily's List, talking to people there, they have really struggled getting their donors fired up about electing women governors. This has been a big challenge for Emily's List, by the way. They had a hard time rallying people for Allison Schwartz. They've had a hard time rallying people for Martha Coakley. Mary Burke was able to, in Wisconsin, was able to get some money raised because of Scott Walker, is somebody that's popular to give money against inside the Democratic donor community. But Emily's List, which of course, they can raise money for Senate candidates, but it's been a real frustration for them that they have not been able to make more inroads here, because you take Hillary Clinton away, the best place to move women into the presidential field is via governorships.
Let's look at some of those.
Done it with Nikki Haley and Susanna Martinez.
Sure,
Right, Republicans are farther ahead of
absolutely
this.
bulletproof.
I think I know
heading
why.
into this. Let's look at some of what else we've just got in terms of poll closings at 8 o'clock with these governor's boards. This is the Florida governor's race that we've been watching so intensely. Look at that, 2/3 of the vote in, 2/3 of the expected vote in Florida. NBC News is calling Charlie Crist versus Rick Scott in Florida too close to call. Look at how tight that difference is between those two candidates with that much of the vote already in. This is going to be amazing to watch unfold in Florida tonight. In Illinois, the governor's race there being characterized by NBC News as too close to call. Pat Quinn, the Democratic incumbent there, facing Bruce Rauner, the Republican. Massachusetts governor's race. This one's very close to my heart. Martha Coakley, the Democrat. Charlie Baker, the Republican. Too close to call, according to NBC News projections at this point. In Maine, the governor's race, the fascinating, almost maybe a three-way race there. Paul LePage, the Republican incumbent, facing off against Elliot Cutler, the independent again, who kind of, sort of, didn't really maybe drop out of the race last week, but still has his name on the ballot. Mike Michaud, the Democrat, facing the Democrat on the ballot there. At this point, too close to call. We've got almost none of the vote in, or in fact, none of the vote in Maine. That'll be an interesting one to watch. Connecticut Governor Dan Malloy and Tom Foley, a rematch for them. Democratic incumbent Dan Malloy here. This one's being called too early to call. Tom Foley and Dan Malloy fought it out very close in 2010. It looks like they will again tonight. In Alabama, NBC can project that the winner of that governor's race will be Robert Bentley, the incumbent Republican governor in Alabama. In Tennessee, the incumbent Republican governor there, Bill Haslam, is the projected winner, according to NBC News. In Maryland, the governor's race there is too early to call. The Democratic candidate there is Anthony Brown. Larry Hogan, the Republican, too early to call in the state of Maryland. That's been an interesting one to watch. In New Hampshire, also too early to call. This is the incumbent Democrat, Maggie Hassan, against Walt Havenstein, the Republican there. We've only just got about 10% of that vote in thus far. Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo is the Democrat in this race. Ellen Fung, the Republican in this race. This is being called too early to call. She'd be the first woman governor of Rhode Island. He'd be the first Asian American governor of Rhode Island. They'll make history either way there. In Oklahoma, it's Joe Dorman, the Democrat, facing off against the incumbent Republican Mary Fallin. This one is too early to call in Oklahoma. Oklahoma, obviously a deep red state. In the Georgia governor's race, just 4% of the vote in thus far. Look at that. Too early to call in Georgia governor. Nathan Deal, the Republican incumbent, facing off against 39-year-old Jason Carter, his Democratic challenger. God, there's so much going on tonight that is unknowable at this point. This is amazing. This is amazing.
There's never, I heard one of the veterans around here has been around watching these elections for decades, said he has never seen so many close elections, that there's just so many. What is going on in the country where every election has to come down to too early, too close,
but
and then it's everywhere.
Anti-status quo this year, number one, but the two parties via money and mechanics have never been more evenly matched, okay? This is sort of, think of it as the Cold War in the 60s and 70s between the Soviets and America. I mean, it's mutually assured destruction financially now. They both found their billionaires this time. Remember, 2010, Republicans did all the outside money. Democrats really never did because President Obama wasn't sure where he stood on that. Remember, and then that's been reversed. So that's why these are all right. Every competitive race is evenly matched financially, ground game, you name it. So guess what? You have close races.
And what really strikes me is that people say in the exit polls the issue that drives people most is the economy. Neither side, in most of these races, candidates didn't talk about the economy. It was all attack ads.
Right.
All this money was just pouring more fuel, more kerosene on the fire and making people hate the process even more.
Right.
And yet there's been a Democratic call to the cavalry, which they used to call the base. And now it's the cavalry, the African-American vote. And if there's a victory in North Carolina tonight, that's what it's going to be about.
Well, I think there's already a victory in Pennsylvania. You've got to remember that not only two things that Corbett became a symbol of, cutting education, where labor went in heavy, and he signed one of the worst voter ID laws in the country.
Right.
And I spent some time in Pennsylvania. They were mobilizing black churches and all of that. So Corbett's defeat is a big plus for the labor and civil rights community. I think that if Christ is successful, I spent a lot of time there this last week, the same thing there, and of course North Carolina. So I'm watching those states. We're seeing in Georgia that blacks are coming out in larger numbers than they thought. We don't know what's going to happen yet, but the reason that none is competitive is there's a large black vote. And I think that clearly a lot of us that have been on the field just dealing with turnout and saying don't let voters ID and ending some of the early voting days are feeling that this is good because we are exceeding numbers in Georgia, and it looks like a real impact.
Let me just interject for a second. We have had a change in one call. It's not conclusive, but in Virginia, we were calling it too early to call. Virginia is now too close to call. Virginia, the Senate race between Ed Gillespie and Mark Warner, 36% of the vote in right now. NBC just changed that to a too close to call.